Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Kim Ricketts, and I manage the Research Visiting Speaker Series. Thank you for joining us as we welcome John Henry Clippinger here to discuss his work on the future of individual identity and his new book, A Crowd of One. Why do drivers warn people they will never meet of police traps by flashing their lights? How did eBay's community of trust make it victorious over the competition? Why do people contribute their anonymous scholarship to Wikipedia? Why do terrorists tend to come from richer and better educated families? These are some of the questions posed by John Clippinger, and he draws upon origin stories, religion, philosophy, and the recent advances in evolutionary biology, anthropology, linguistics, and neuroscience to argue, to argue that human beings are innately cooperative with highly evolved strategies of collaboration and trust. Rather in contrast, I would say, to our economic and social models that operate on the assumption that we are all selfish and materialistic individuals. With this understanding, could we use this dawning digital age to invent new social roles and identities and build highly efficient communities of shared interest? And in our new digitalized society, who decides who you are and who do you trust? The ability to define your own identity and that of others is becoming the battleground of the future, John writes. And the questions he asks in A Crowd of One will have profound implications for what we do here at Microsoft and for everything from social networking and virtual worlds to leadership in business and even to the structure of our military presence in the world. John Henry Clippinger is a senior fellow at the Berkman Center for Internet and Society at Harvard Law, and he has worked for the Department of Defense and is the author of books on artificial intelligence, language, business, and self-organizing networks. Among many other endeavors, he holds 3 software patents and worked with MIT to design the first program to simulate complex, self-reflective human conversation. I'm thrilled to have him join us here at Microsoft Research.
Well, thank you very much. No, I'm really looking forward to this, and we should regard it as a conversation because this is one of the places in the world where people are inventing the future. And I think it's so important to have conversations about what the technology can be, particularly as we start to invent new kinds of social technologies. What I'd like to do is ask some questions to get a sense of the audience. One is how many people have an avatar in Second Life? 1. How many people have been to Second Life? Let's put it that way. Interesting. Okay. 2. They're smart. How many people are familiar with card space? Okay, interesting. All right, I'll stop there. Pardon? Well, what I'd like to, as you can gather, the scope of the book is rather broad. And what I'd like to do is there's 2 parts to the talk. And I really am going to go fairly quickly through it, and it'll be a bit of a fire hose, and I'm going to hitting certain points. And so I hope we can drill down later in the conversation to around points that are of interest and relevance to people here. And I'm sure that there are people that have strong opinions and backgrounds, and there's more expertise in the audience than there is on the stage, so it'll add to a good conversation. But the first part, I'd like to talk about what it says there's a new narrative about what human nature is and what identity is. It's very different than the traditional narrative, at least the one that I'm familiar with, in that how we look at ourselves, how we make sense of ourselves, how we explain human activity, how we basically imagine social institutions and explain their functioning. And the perspective I would take is one more like social physics. That there was a term we threw out. So why are people doing the things that they're doing? It doesn't make any sense because you try to look at some model of intentionality and purpose and decisions, right? And it's, no, it's just that you get us under certain situations. It's just a question of certain principles of social physics kick in. And I'd like to sort of elaborate this new kind of narrative because I think it has real implications when we start to, how we think about designing new kinds of social technologies, especially things like social networks, identity systems, how do you manage identity, a lot of stuff that's going on in sort of the next generation web. And then the second section is really look at a digital identity, and I sort of make sort of 6 quasi-provocative predictions that I hope will generate some conversation and some light, maybe. And so start out with a lot of what we've learned, at least what I was taught about rationality, human identity, groups, individuality, emotion, reason, is basically wrong. I'll be provocative and throw that out. And that many of the received truths, that in a sense that we assume, it's sort of our natural embedded narrative, are also wrong. So how we conceive of things in terms of explained behaviors, even say with the kind of designing social networks and how people act and how they respond to one another, are based on certain premises that are quite archaic. And I think, as I said, this has huge implications when you think of developing collaborative software or doing any kind of cooperative modeling. I've been very interested in sort of how to build collaborative systems. I started one of the things I didn't mention, a number of startup companies, and particularly I've been interested in sort of self-organizing social networks, why people share, why people don't share, and sort of what are the underlying models to explain that. And so I'd like to sort of lay that out in a sort of a high-level discussion that we may.
One example of something you taught which is wrong.
Which is wrong?
Yes.
I think it would be a number of things would be wrong. I mean, that's how we learn.
One.
Well, what's that? Brain is not a blank slate? I mean, I think, well, I don't go off with the intention of doing wrong things in a talk. I think that what you try to do is you try to explain something the best way you can in a way that can be refuted, is clear enough to say, okay, that's incomplete, here's another point of view, and then you further the discussion.
I think what he's asking for is an example of what you just said in the previous slide, was many of the things we know about.
I'm sorry. I completely misread the question. Well, I'm getting to that. I'm sorry. I'm getting to that. Oh, yes. I'm teeing that up. I'm sorry. I completely misunderstood yours. One of the examples is, and this is a case in point, is that a lot of people think of the early on, at least when I was in graduate school, they thought of intelligence as being a general capability, that the brain was sort of a blank slate. There's a book by Steven Pinker to this point. I'm sure a number of you have read it. And there is a sort of presumption that there's a general sense of rationality, that people can problem solving, and in fact that there's the prominence of reason over emotion, and that they're two separate spheres. And what you find that the brain is not so much a blank slate by any means. It is a highly specialized, what I call jerry-rigged legacy system. There's layers upon layers, and if you look on the diagram there of the amygdala, one of the amygdala it plays a very dominant role in some of the key decisions that people make, and as much of it, we'll get to that in a minute. People are nodding. Much of it is preconscious. And our brain is really, it's like a social organ. It's evolved as a social. There's a lot of social competencies, and over periods of time that evolved reflect its evolutionary history. So, well, the first point is some of the most important decisions that you make in your life, sort of who you marry, who you're willing to die for, who you trust. Those are at a level, often at the amygdala level, there's not unconscious. So you'll have an oxytocin hit, a serotonin, you have a whole dopamine and reward system, fight, flight, very primary decisions that you're not even aware of, that commit you to actions that are not conscious. They're not, and so we have a sense of ourselves as being this reflective beings. We're in control. We are rational. But in fact, key life decisions are not particularly individual decisions. They're sort of wired in from the point of view of a species rather than the individual. Now, you have the notion of mirror neurons. I don't know if people are familiar with that. But that's a relatively recent discovery. And the fact is that people have the ability to emphasize or sort of simulate what other people think. And the reason that evolved is you can say, well, it leads to much more coordinated behavior. There's a sense of empathy, a shared theory of mind, therefore more efficient kinds of sharing. And it's not just in humans, actually. It's other social species as well. It's just very well developed in humans. And you think, well, all right, why did that evolve? Because taking any kind of sort of real estate in the brain is very expensive real estate. So it had some, what we call an evolutionary stable strategy. It had some purpose there that persists, built upon, which was not so. It was not what we would think in sort of the classic rational model. Certainly the model of sort of classic neoclassic economics. So that is another sort of new departure. And then to really look at the brain as I say, a social organism, in that organ, in that you have the ability to interpret and generate myriads of very complicated social signals. And I'll get into this more about why this is so important. I think it's very important when you start to think about social networks, because social networks form around trusted social signals. And a lot of those signals are wired in. It's not like something that someone conceived. These are there from the beginning, and it's sort of what frames us. It's not something we necessarily choose. And so there are a number of social emotions. There's the neuroscientist Tommasio. Tommasio wrote one of his first books is Descartes' Error, which he really challenged the whole, destroyed, in my view, the whole notion of separation of emotion and reason on a neurological basis. And that was a number of years ago, but I think that's been brought up more and more, that even in the frontal cortex, you have an infusion of lower level functions, limbic system functions so this whole idea that we are disinterested rational players, it's not the way we work. But also we have very particular kinds of social emotions that trigger different reactions that we signal to one another, that then we're able to coordinate and synchronize our behaviors. And those evolved over periods of time. And not just in the human beings, but in a variety of social species. I mean, there's arguments that a vampire bat has a notion of disgust, emotion of disgust. I mean, so you have other social species that they regulate their behaviors among themselves by very highly targeted social signals. So when we think about the sort of the pillars of the Enlightenment thinking, I mean, Descartes, we took Descartes to task. Hobbs, and I'll get to Hobbs in a minute, but Hobbs, the whole notion of state of nature, that people are in a state of nature, they're naturally self-interested, not other-regarding, therefore they need a source of authority, and then the romance of Rousseau. So the individual as being the social atom by which you can construct societies. It's not accurate. And I don't mean to go back in history, but sort of for its own sake, but these ideas still permeate our thinking currently. It's not like they've been abandoned. I mean, if you take the notion of state of nature, this is, if you look at this figure here, it's the Leviathan, the king. And there's an argument for the king. You notice he's outside the wall of the city. He's outside the city. He's in this, quote, in state of nature. And it is assumed that since things are so chaotic and that people are just solely self-interested, that you have to have a strong authority. And it has to be so you have sort of what people call Hobbesian traps. You have the whole idea of tit for tat. In other words, you cannot trust anyone, so you get into a sort of zero-sum, we'll say winner-take-all strategy rather than a cooperative game. The presumption is that that's the way, quote, lower forms of life, nature, other social species function. It's not true. I mean, even on primates, they don't work that way. They have a sense of empathy. They have a sense of cooperation. Yes, you have dominant alphas, but it's not all a matter of just alphas going after each other. So you have a sort of cartoon notion of what Darwinian selection was. I mean, and this was the one that I was brought up with. And it is not, so there's a controversy around this. There are those who will, the selfish genius school and everything will argue that you don't have cooperation or what they call multi-level selection, that it all happens on the individual level. But the fact of the matter is that more and more thinking is coming around applying the principles of evolutionary game theory to understanding cooperation to evolution, and you're sort of taking a new view, which is, I don't know if you can see that, but it is a cooperation. I'm glad you like that. That's one of my favorite cartoons out of New Yorker. You know, and so it's a whole problem to deal with a collective action problem. And if you have sufficient coordination, and you can know who you're dealing with, in a common line of interest, then the little guy can team up against the big guy. And I think that has a lot of implications going forward, because it's quite how do you scale these things. So now we get to the question of identity. And that's really, and that's a tricky one. And a lot of the thinking is that people's identity is something that can be self-asserted. I know who I am. I invented myself. This is, I know the me. And this is sort of the atomic, irreducible me. Well, I think that's not really correct. And I think that you have to recognize that who you are is a function of your many interactions and multiple roles. And if you look at some of the work that's been done on feral children and how or the fact that kids who are raised in the wild without human contact have no language. They have no empathy. They have a psychological and physical dwarfism. They don't physiologically grow. So you'll have a 16-year-old kid who will actually be the size of a 6 or 7-year-old kid. So who we are, even as human beings, depend upon certain kinds of triggers and interactions, even for our own physiological development. So it's a very fundamental notion. And the idea that you have sort of the individual against the group. In fact, if you look at biology, there's this sort of a false dualism that sort of came, some of them argue, some of the evolution biologists would say, it's not the organism against the environment. They co-evolve. It's a joint niche construction. And that is a very different way of thinking about it, because, and I won't get into the whole issue of semantics, but how you start to understand something, and it gets into language, and I haven't even touched on language here. But semantics is sort of this sort of folding in of the outside in the inside, and so there's a loose coupling between the two. So to have a community, you really have to have a sort of persistent, trusted identity for cooperation and community. And I think a lot of when I started looking at the whole area of identity, you think about, identity management, security, it's a compliance problem. It's not, but it's really fundamental to building extendable, scalable networks, social networks, I'd argue. And the other thing about it is that I think when people look at social networks and they say, okay, it used to be, 6 degrees of separation, links. I am linked to someone, so if someone knows someone who knows someone, then I know mousy tongues, whoever. I mean, and I have 650,000 friends. It's not the way it works. We got to realize this is one of the most sophisticated things that people have in their heads, is ability to read social signals. And it's sub-threshold, and so you're constantly sending out signals, negotiating signals. I mean, just look at the power of social signals. One of the most powerful one is to detect the health or mate-worthiness of someone. So symmetry is a very important thing. Well, you look at magazines, and 90% of the magazines are out there. They have this signaling, and then there's deceptive signaling going out, because they can get all sorts of cosmetics and other things to make you look other than you are. But this is just for a certain demographic that explains a huge amount of the behaviors. And one can look at Facebook and MySpace as a context in which people can do lots of social signaling. And by that, express themselves, define themselves, develop certain relationships of trust. But we're just in the early infancy of that. So I'm going to do a gross generalization. And that is that a lot of evolutionary processes are all about knowing whom you can trust. I mean, if you look at the immune system, defining boundaries between in and out, in-group, out-group, under what conditions. All of that is really sort of a key sort of constant negotiation. There's a lot of work that's been done in evolutionary biologists on the whole idea of reciprocity, extended reciprocity, network reciprocity, and how you can scale trust based upon certain kind of network properties. Now listen, there's some people here I know who are working on that. So it's really important to know, how do I know whom to trust? And I would just sort of go through and then how to create a cost for that. In other words, trust is not just blind trust. Trust is really a question of managing risk, and there's a whole risk management model that can be applied to that. So how do I create a sufficient cost for someone who can deceive me that the payoff does not exceed that cost? And so there's a whole field of biology called the handicapping principle and social, and so they sort of calculate that to say to what extent, what does that cost have to be, and has that a non-gameable cost? And we can talk about that. So this would get back to the point of managing a risk. A lot of people think security is a question of eliminating a breach. I've done a certain amount of work with the DoD, and they're looking at a new identity system. And the traditional model of DoD is to have everything be top-down, command and control, pull all the information in, build as many walls around it, and then act like it can never be breached. And if it's breached, don't tell anybody, because you'll lose your career. And it's a mess. But it's a real national security issue, because what happens is you have all these different agencies. I mean, you thought it was bad before, now with Homeland Security and all what they're doing now, they really don't know how to make it a mess. And so there's no incentive to share. There's no mechanism by which you can then identify a failure and quickly correct it, because you have to go back up a command and control structure, and there's no incentive for the individual to, in a sense, take over it. Now, the view that we've taken is that you would like to have information, break it down to the smallest number of attributes possible, and have it very distributed. So if something's lost, it's not revealing, totally revealing, and the local parties can handle it, rather than having it go back a command and control hierarchy. And this is something they're more open to, and they're starting to realize the problems of it. But culturally, it's extremely difficult for them to do, because they have a risk model that says if anyone is responsible for a breach of security, it's all over. And with new technology, and there's no way you can have a totally secure system. I mean, and so so they're going to have to rethink it, instead of like, what is the margin of risk we're willing to accept, and how do we underwrite that risk, rather than we think that we can eliminate it. So it really is, if you look at evolution as sort of this unending sort of arms race. I mean, there's no safe, secure final point. You say, okay, I'm secure. The barbarians will never come crawling over the walls. I'm safe. We all know that in software. But it's also an important thing to know whom to exclude and punish. There's a benign side to this, that we're cooperative. It's true, but there are times when we need to be competitive, and there also be times when you need to punish free riders. And a free rider and a lot of the research will show if you have too many free riders, it'll destroy the trust in the whole group. So you've really got to have a way of doing that. And there are people or groups that have to take on the cost of being so the altruistic aspect of punishment, because they may not benefit them, but it preserves the group in order to take out the free riders. But if we look at the web, there is no secure, open, or interoperable way of managing identity. I mean, it was invented with that identity layer. I mean, I remember in graduate school, it was the ARPANET then, and we could go look at the computers. We look at Marvin Minsky's email, we could read his calendar, and then we could go to the Pentagon. You see what's going on there. Didn't last too long, but it was fun while it lasted. But it was an attitude that we weren't labeled terrorists at that point. We'd been Guantanamo for this, but it really wasn't a big issue. But now, of course, it is. Now, what I'm going to try to do is talk about the virtual identity. See if we're going to get. This is a trailer from Second Life, and I've played with this before, and it will work. You just have to. Yes. And this was done about
life beyond reality.
This was done about 2 or 3 years ago.
Where
life beyond reality. Think of that.
No bounds.
No bounds.
And the world is anything but ordinary. It's a land of infinite opportunity, where action and adventure reach far beyond normal. It's an ever-changing world, rich with promise. So vast, so versatile, so exhilarating.
So you have all these different identities and avatars, and they're defying physics. You're not bounded. So its identity is being
transform
sort of
your
having
being.
No restriction. That's your freedom.
Tempt fate without inhibition. Court danger without fear. Indulge every passion. From Linden Lab, Second Life.
Get one.
Get one.
What's fascinating to me about this is that, let me make sure I didn't. All right. Is the emphasis on the sort of total plasticity of who you are, and it really appeal to that. I mean, so there's a libertarian world that you can be yourself. But if you look at what happens, most of the people sort of have default to looking like porn stars or something. There is not necessarily the breadth of imagination you would think, and you sort of default to certain stereotypes. And my thinking is that what would just start to surface in these worlds is the emergence of sort of these innate patterns. But we're at a point where we can start to reimagine what identity is. And this is where this idea of the person can control, the whole idea of user-centric identity. And there's work that's been done here. I mentioned card space. I don't know how many people know Kim Cameron, but Kim, and they've been Microsoft has been very generous to the Berkman Center, and we worked on a project called the Identity Meta System, and it worked with Kim, and it was the whole idea of a user-centric interoperable identity system in which the people had control over information about themselves. It wasn't in a repository, and that's a huge shift, and the card space is a first move in that direction. And you can have multiple identities. I mean, part of this is to recognize that you're not a single person. You have different identities in different contexts, and you have different rules and relationships for those that only you necessarily know how they all link together. And we can go into that. There's a lot of security issues in that. But it's a different architecture than the one we thought of before. And part of the interest in virtual worlds, which has really surprised me, is there's a lot of interest among corporations now. People like Fidelity, Sears, Best Buy, Bank of America. How do you take your identity from one virtual world into another and go in and out of them? So Second Life is opened up as client. It's going to open up as server so that people can then start to take not just themselves but all their 3D assets and use them in different worlds. And I asked these companies, I said, now are you comfortable with, say, Fidelity? You get all that financial information about a person. They take that and they go somewhere else. They go to Schwab. They get an offer from Schwab because they own it themselves. And they say, that's the game. That's where it's going. We're comfortable with it. That's a big, big, big shift. That's a breakdown in an old business model of the walled gardens and trying to make everyone stick in one place to get it creating mobility. The other thing that's interesting is that we're getting more sophisticated about anonymity. I mean, privacy was sort of the 60 to 70 ways of talking about it, I think. And when you think about managing an identity, you have an anonymity. There's certain situations when you should be able to be anonymous. You may want to be pseudo-anonymous or have an authenticated identity. That means you don't have to reveal everything about yourself. You have to just know that you're over 21 in order to get a drink or whatever you have to do. And only you know who the real you is, where you live. All that disclosive information can be something that is blinded to a third party or relying party. So there are lots of ways that we can start to architect in a very nuanced way, and this gets into social signaling and social network, how much information is disclosed under what conditions. And that's where the metadata becomes extremely important in driving these kind of interactions. And so on top of that, if you take this whole model of what is a pure sort of open source identity, peer network user-centric, people can develop their own networks of trust, peer networks of trust, their own reputation systems. They can testify, vouch for one another, and be able to manage their own level of risk between one another, rather than have to go to an authenticating party, a centralized authenticating party, which would be a bank or government. So we open up enormous opportunities for social invention. Now what I'd like to do here is go, for some reason I couldn't get this to run in this mode. So we have to do a little regression. Yes, okay. For some reason. Whoops, come on, try it again. There's a little lag times here. You're going back.
I could be whoever I wanted for a price.
This is something that's only produced by themselves in Second Life.
Tall,
it's much more
big,
recent.
Small. Black. White. Muscle bound. Perhaps older. Or maybe a perfectly rendered digital facsimile of my carbon-based self. I decided that in this new world, at least who I was would remain constant, except for maybe a new set of clothes.
What's so interesting about that is that the people we talk to is that going from being a fantasy figure to having a persistent identity that looks somewhat like you, I think is probably where things are going to go. And because you're going to be traveling different worlds, you want other people to recognize you. And there's some technology I wanted to show here, but I couldn't get it to run, where you can take a very inexpensive camera phone and take a picture of people, take a picture of you, and I can enroll you that way. So it can recognize who you are. It generates a signature, mathematical signature on your face. So it can validate who you are on your face. And they can also generate a 3D avatar. And then you can Photoshop it and do all, whatever you want. But that can then be your persistent self. And I think you're going to see things like that. And so I think that what's interesting is that when if you look at Second Life, they were really talking about you can be anything you want. It's a community that really encourages anonymity, that now they're actually very strong about being able to develop technology to help create authenticated identity in Second Life. And using credentials outside of Second Life is to testify who you are in Second Life. So this Project Higgins is something that we've been working on the last 3 years at the Berkman Center. It's an open source, user-centric identity infrastructure that allows you to have multiple identities, share it. There's a common data model so you can create some mobility that we're talking about. And it's been, Microsoft is now a supporter of this. IBM it was quite amazing that we got all these different parties to come together. And Kim was a great statesman in doing this. And his blog was one of the really the center points of all this discussion. So what I'd like to sort of talk about is a little bit sort of inventing digital institutions and going forward, because I think that's where it's going to happen. It's going to happen in software companies, it's going to happen in universities, it's going to have people going to figure out new ways of collaborating and new ways of resolving disputes. Once things become open, we have new kinds of new networks. So you're going to have more peer governance mechanisms. You're also going to rely more on metrics. I think metrics of risk and reputation would be very important. And by reputation systems, I just don't mean the simple ones like an eBay, where you can have people sort of reward each other. Actually, metrics of reputation based upon network properties and behaviors. Some interesting work's being done on that. And then the transparency of all forms of authority. I think the Leviathan notion of a blind obedience to a figure's authority, that world is sort of gone. I think you're really having people, it's going to be performance-based, it's going to be challenged. And I was talking to friends at Google. They're saying that's sort of the corporate culture that they now have. The hierarchy doesn't now matter. He said, well, what's the data for that? And so it'll be much more algorithmic. It'll be much more performance-based, and that's a huge shift. And that, I think, will accelerate sort of digital experimentation. So I'd like to end with sort of 6 predictions. I've alluded to them here. And the information will break out of the silos. And that's a big deal for a lot of things. That's a big change in the business model. Walled gardens are going to go down. I thought that was a wish. But now when you see bigger companies saying that they're going to happen, they also see a new economic model coming out of that. And to that point, Brad Smith, who's your general counsel, I heard him give a talk at Berkman on this, and he's saying there was a project at Berkman called on interoperability, and part of it is looking at interoperability of business models. Because the business models line up, and a lot of technologies will line up. They're not going to be gaming it at those margins. And so you're going to have ideas of like making markets in a wide range of preferences, social and economic preferences. You're going to be able to aggregate around that if you have trusted identity systems. And I think there's the ability to manage identities across different kind of boundaries and know who you're dealing with and doing it really well is going to be a do or die competency. And I brought up the DoD as an example on more of the die than the do, and it's a big issue there, and it's going to be very, very challenging, that kind of flexibility. Again, I mentioned metrics, and I think the ability, just like in the credit card companies, you get FICO scores, you'll be able to manage the risk of assigning credit once you have the behavioral metrics there. It's going to be very, very critical in creating a security and sort of the liquidity of preferences between people. Also, what I think is very exciting, we just alluded to it in Second Life, is the whole idea of new kind of payment systems and currencies that are being generated. Not only in Second Life do you have something called Linden dollars, and you have people who are real millionaires, and with Linden dollars, but it's also in China. There's something called QQ. For people familiar with that, 226 million members. They have the Q coin. So they have a whole currency system. And how do you go in and out of a virtual world in a physical world? How's that arbitrage opportunity going to exist? Who's going to regulate it? Who's going to play in it? But there's big money to be made in that. And there are ways in which you can develop new kinds of currencies that reflect certain values of a social network. So a social network should be able to have its own currencies. And you can think of reward programs as a kind of currency, social currencies. And I think that is going to be a huge one, and how you can convert from a social currency reward program into a fiat currency or a real payment system. And I think the virtual web is going to be happening a lot faster than I thought. I mean, one of the things, when I first saw Second Life, and it was about 2 years ago, I just thought this was a gimmick. I said, people are going to have better things to do than dress up as raccoons and fly through the air. It just, it's just okay. That's, I just totally discounted it. But friends kept coming back at me on this. And then I started to see some of the activity and kind of things that you could do. And once you get over sort of the clunkiness of a lot of it, and the cliquiness and the clunkiness, you see absolutely enormous creativity taking place and inventing all sorts of, you can't keep up with the number of ideas and new kinds of businesses and institutions or organizations are being created there. And some of them very, very high quality. Those stores, retail stores. If you look at, say, IBM has gone into Second Life. They have 4,000 of their employees who are regularly part of Second Life. They're building retail stores for Sears and a variety of other parties. Adidas, Nike, you name every major brand is in and out of it. And then when you have someone like when you have Fidelity, who's one of the more hard-headed companies I know, and I did a lot of consulting with them, is that they're making a major commitment to it because they recognize retirement planning is a socialization process, and people don't like to talk about it. It's very important, and so it's like having to lose weight. It's the planning. You need friends and colleagues and so peers to help you socialize to do the kind of things that you don't want to do. So they're looking for a medium that is more broad, is a broader bandwidth of expressiveness to enable these kinds of things. So I'll leave you with that. I hope I raised some questions here, and let me. So I hope I can answer some of them. Thank you very much. Questions?
Would you go, I think it was your third question up there. Third? On the last.
That one?
No, not that one. Go to one.
Prediction or question?
Yeah, go to the second one. Could you talk a little bit more about the kind of
what I mean by that?
Markets in terms of preferences here?
Yeah. I think that we mentioned Higgins, and Higgins, the reason called Higgins is it's a name for a Tasmanian long-tailed mouse. And the idea is, okay, how if you're able to efficiently identify in a fine-grained fashion what people's preferences are, and you can match up. You can actually have the metadata and match up and secure and be secure on the other side. Then you're going to be linking buyers and sellers around such preferences, and the cost of that is going to be de minimis, more and more. So it's going to be it's your absolute efficient market making systems. Then if you have reputation systems that you can say, well, now this person has that reputation, it's persistent, it's non-gameable, and then I will do business in that world that has that reputation system because my transaction costs, my failures, my clearances will be less. Then You create a new kind of business model. And it's not just dollar transaction. I mean, you also look, how do I meet people who share certain interests and certain values? Well, there are other people who vouch for them. You'll have more finer level distinctions. I mean, it's part of what eBay did with the eBay communities. I mean, you really look at eBay, they'll say it's an auction, but it's not really an auction. It's social commerce. And so it's a combination. And I think when you combine that with new kind of social currencies, people like that, you're going to develop these embedded communities and networks. They're going to have their own sort of dynamics. Yeah.
If you take, there's been concern, I guess, from the social, side of the world, I guess, in comparing reality to these virtual worlds and the fear of physical human isolation. Have there been studies done on satisfaction between reality-based life and second life, meaning virtual life? And is there actual isolation from a social perspective, or are they finding that it's? I
think you find a lot of studies. But let me just challenge the division you made there. I was giving a talk at Harvard, and Charlie Nesson, who's a law professor and a founder of the Berkman Center, and he was saying that, and he made a really valid point, is that even in the physical life, the real life, everything is constructed itself. The idea, the brain, what we see and what we share is a social construction. There isn't like sort of a this is real and this is not. It is a blur. It is a socially mediated blur. And I think for some, I think it varies with people that you're going to have certain personality types that are going to be drawn. I mean, that's the amazing thing about Second Life is you have these worlds within worlds, and so people sort of create their own communities that run by their own rules, and some are going to have one set, some are going to be off several standard deviations out, and some are going to be more modest. So to me, my underlying argument is like there are these natural dynamics that we're seeing in the real world in evolution now are being transposed in a digital way at an accelerated rate. And so the fact that we can reflect upon them then means that we have a greater opportunity. Yes?
Yeah, so these are very bold predictions you're making.
Absolutely.
But, one of the things that strikes me about them is that, as far as I can tell, everything about the history of economics and business and identity runs exactly in the opposite direction from everything you're predicting. That if you look, say, back to the 14th, 15th century, it was basically your dream world. If you wanted to come to a new town, your identity was yours to make, and if you wanted to do business with someone, you relied on a letter from your cousin, the burgher of Antwerp, and a letter saying that you were
I wouldn't agree with that at all.
Well, let me continue the description. Yeah. I mean, this was how it worked. It was a purely peer-to-peer system. There was no standardization, no centralization of any of the the means of transactions or of identity or of reputation. Everything was completely on the basis of friends knowing friends and this kind of thing. And every step since then has been, in fact, centralization, standardization of all of these things. We've had everybody's banks, currencies, credit systems, and got to the point where today you can go into any random store anywhere in the world, basically, and plop down a card, and there's a centralized system with complete standardization of all of these things that allows you to buy stuff and get on credit and identify yourself and rent cars and do things like that. And it seems to me that we rely on this so much every day that it's hard to believe that we give all that up for the kinds of
I don't know. Let me wind back because okay, sure. I don't agree with your premise, historical premise. I'll get to that. Okay. And I'm not saying you have to give it up. I think this is actually. I mean, this infrastructure enables a lot more of this than a reduction. But if you look at, and I actually write about it a lot in this book, is the transition between a feudal period and the Renaissance, so the 13th century Renaissance, where you had the evolution of banking system. You had an extremely hierarchical system. You had the chain of being. You had roles that were fixed. If anything was, You were a son of. Your names were defined by your community, who your father was, who your profession was. You were very much fixed roles, and it was part of the church. And so to deviate from a whole, so it was God ordained, king ordained, the nobility. So your roles were so. And one of the things that happened in the Renaissance that changed that. I mean, and there's a wonderful study that's done by John Padgett, University of Chicago, and it has lots of data on this, and it's an empirical input-output model, which shows that you had a breakdown in that, and you had a mixing of social networks, redefinition of roles, new ways of authenticating people that created a social liquidity that never existed before. The same thing happened in the 18th century in the Enlightenment in Scotland, when you had the transition from Scotland with the Presbyterians, the Jacobean system into a whole new,
You're talking about law and politics.
No, I'm not.
Never worked that way.
No, I'm not. No, I'm talking exactly about commerce. I'm talking exactly about commerce in the Renaissance. The studies were done on Francesca Tini was the first inventor of what was not only the modern corporate organization. You had double entry bookkeeping. You had what they called social commerce developed there. There was different sets of roles that broke from the church, that controlled the church. There was a whole break with hierarchy and rigidity. It created you had roles of the Renaissance men, where multiple roles that never existed before. So I just have to, sorry.
I also wanted to disagree before he came. I guess the meaning is that we're on the brink of something revolutionary. And artificial intelligence speaks about it for at least half a century. Every day we're on the brink of changing. So here is my simple prediction to make a long story short. In 100 years, Descartes will be known better than Google. Will be known better than Google.
All right. Well, we'll wait for that then. Yes.
I would disagree with both of these gentlemen.
Yeah.
I think in the past 20, 30 years, we've seen commerce change in ways that it's never, the rate of evolution is increasing, and this is it seems to me like a logical next step. I also wanted to comment on your question, which I think Second Life kind of breaks down a lot of the distinctions, like what you made. There's a study recently done where they took disabled people. It enables them to be social. The definition of being social, about being isolated in your house yet on Second Life, kind of is an oxymoron in a sense. I think there's almost a generational boundary of people that can appreciate this fact and people that can't. And one question I have for you, although it's not necessarily touching on identity, is do you think there's a point at which there will be singularity between these virtual worlds and the actual worlds? A lot of the work that I've been looking into is ubiquitous computing and wearable computing and such. And it seems like another natural next.
I agree. One of the things that we're working with at MIT is to set up a joint center on virtual living with Harvard and MIT on that. We call it the singularity. But it's when those two come fused together, and when you're a real digital native, you don't make the distinctions. That's a generational thing, and I'm definitely in that generation. But so it's invisible to you. And I think that's more and more. And I think so there's a generation from that distinction will not be a valid distinction, I think, because it'll be a new synthesis. It's not it's a new category that'll come out. Yeah.
So the generational aspect of this is kind of an interesting part. So is the evolution of this? Does it sort of need to wait to some extent, for a generation to grow up and move on to be the people that are decision makers who really understand the potential? And is there?
Okay, this is a really interesting question. But let me deconstruct the question, because it's sort of that presumes that the decision making is a rational decision. There are parties here they'll say, now's the time to do it. I don't think it works that way. I think it's very viral. I think that a lot of it's that. There are going to be innovators who will pick this up. It may be a younger generation, an open source community, but then it will establish itself as being a far more efficient and effective way of doing things. That it'll create business models that will outcompete the others. And I think, and it'll be very viral on that basis. So I think, so when you look at a lot of the innovations in the net, I mean, it wasn't, there was, so a wise father said, yes, this is when we're going to do this. I mean, I was in a large consulting firm and trying to convince people that the net was something real, and they just looked at me like I was totally nuts, you know. It'll never happen. What? Pardon?
It was the traditional advertising. Look at it, Google, right, 5 years ago.
Right. I mean, it was just like people said, well, what are these kids going to tell us? It's not going to happen. I mean, and why do I need to go digital? I mean, you get these, and it's just, and the same thing with business models. You're finding the same thing with sort of like everyone who doesn't sort of have a DRM protection, but this sort of, okay, a property model is that's sort of a sacred right, and that's what anything other than that's piracy. And say no, it's going to flip into a new kind of model, and you're going to open up, and it's going to outcompete that old model. And even those guys are now saying, maybe that's happening. Maybe we can't suppress it all. But there are the challenges to get the new business model. But when that happens, there's going to be a rush for that. I mean, look at what Google's done to advertising. I mean, and look at the margins they have. It's unbelievable. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to speak to that. I also don't think we have to wait for some, I don't know, big proof in the sky to decide this is happening. I think we have real clear evidence of the average citizen, not trying to use the internet, who has been creating a new little chunk of their identity every different website that they went to register at. And I mean, the mind is exploding trying to keep track of all the IDs and passwords. I mean, if the Federation technologies and card-based technologies that my group works on, one of the main attractors to the average person is just because it makes it easier. I already did all that stuff somewhere.
Right.
If I can use it in another place, that's good.
Easy.
But single sign-on.
Doesn't take a corporate executive to come to reach that conclusion or mandate that it happen. I mean, my wife and my son get it.
But, I was thinking about it from the concept, partly too from the concept of adoption, because there's even between me and my teenage children and what they do on the web and messenger contacts and cell phone. I mean, there's a lot of integration that happens with the technology that just isn't friendly to the older generation. They don't really understand it. They don't see a benefit for it, and the cost of learning all of these things is very high. And so there's a lot of innovation, there's a lot of new things happening, but there's a whole generation of people that kind of aren't participating in this. And even though you could say, well, people don't want to have to remember passwords and logins and all their different websites, but if the cost of learning the new technology that would enable them to not have that problem anymore is higher than the cost of remembering all the passwords, it's just going to have, to some extent, that there's a very large segment of the population that isn't going to participate in this.
Yes, but I don't think, I would never argue with that statement. It's absolutely true. That's our challenge. Yeah. We've got to figure out how to get the cost and the applicability down to widen the audience. And if we don't do it, you're right. There'll be a bunch of people that won't be able to use it.
Right. But to me, that's one of, just to put a point on the really interesting about going to virtual worlds. I mean, the Second Life's very clunky. But Sony's got another one called Home. It will get much more natural. So by being yourself, leveraging your natural language, your ability to signal and everything, you are able to do things you otherwise couldn't do, and that I think, then I think you're starting to take the takeoff. And that was sort of struck me about, oh, okay, maybe this thing is going to may happen and see beyond the raccoon head, you know.
I had a question with regard to trust. So in a virtual world, then, how do you exclude and punish? Because you could just then move to another virtual world. What's the social construct for punishment for lack of?
Well, I mean, the exclusion. I mean, in other words, if someone, part of this, and this is the big challenge, is how do you have a root identity, and by that is like a biometrically certified identity, and this makes people nervous. But in other words, if you take I mentioned being able to use a cell phone, take a picture of yourself, and generate an avatar. Well, actually, that's pretty much who you are. I can go on the machine. I can have a false USB plug, and I can get a certified machine. But then someone else could come in and be someone else. But if it's a 3D interaction, then I'll know it's me. And so if someone is willing, if someone is a bad actor, and you throw them out, and you have a way of authenticating, then you have real costs being associated. In other words, it'd be really great to be in that community. That's my job. It's everyone I know. You said, no, that's it. You're out. and is tied to your biometric self, then that creates real accountability, and it works on the whole trust metric calculation. Yeah.
I kind of disagree with that. Finish the other side, answer your question.
Oh.
We don't have a solution to it yet.
Because if you have multiple identities and multiple realities, then you mitigate risk by just spreading yourself out through.
Yeah, but you'd have to if you have to have a single signature, there's a single unique identifier to get it. I mean this.
I wasn't talking about the technology. I was talking about the answer to your question as a deploy, as an inventor and creator of the stuff. We haven't deployed a widely in-use system that makes it impossible for me to re-enter the community under the guise of someone else.
No, that's right. No, that's right. That
aren't there.
Yeah, that doesn't exist. That's right. That does
forcing somebody to do that is already a punishment.
Pardon?
Forcing somebody to re-enter under a new identity.
It's a cost. It's a cost, right. And some people incur it more than others. But that's right. And so you try escalating the cost. And the open ID stuff is now, sort of on blogs, you see this is now starting to pick up. But I think what happens, then people sort of follow the line of reasoning and say, yeah, okay, make it really difficult at a root identity level. And so if they really try to go back in, you can throw them out and have real consequences.
So I kind of disagree with the idea that you want all the identities to merge. So of course you don't want to have like a separation physical versus virtual, but I think actually it's a benefit that you can have completely separate identities.
I didn't say merge. Okay. I didn't say merge. I didn't say merge. No. I think you can have discrete identities, and you can have. I know they link. These different cells of mine, I know who they link, but I'm the only one that links them, not some other third party. And I can have, but then I could have a root identity. I mean, we're getting into new kinds of social design that this is new. To what extent does the government have the right to say I can penetrate? You have a high level identity, and under certain circumstances, then I have a warrant because you can constitute a security risk that I know who you are at your root identity.
Well, these days the government can do whatever they want.
Right.
But, I mean, so that's
true too.
But I think like even identities that are not tied to any person have existed for centuries. Like think about corporations, for example. The whole purpose is to create identities out of for artificial identities so that you can do trade and things without actually associated
different roles, different
personas. And you can't have a corporate biometric tests. I mean, so clearly thinking around something like that doesn't make sense. I mean, if we want to go back to a corpus like a root identity, which is tied to some biometric information, then I think that's kind of undoing a lot of history as well.
I think in order to have real accountability, you're going to need that. I mean, there's HSPT 12 cards that are coming out of DOD that establish root identity, and one of the problems there is it's required for 3 million government employees, and it'll be all contractors, and it'll bleed out to the edge, and I think it's not an issue you can run from.
And of course, there are multiple governments in that.
Right, and there are different policies in different countries. In Belgium, I mean, you have a whole different, and you have a very centralized identity system. But my argument is that you want to make it as pluralistic as possible and make it as hard as possible to identify the root identity. But you need a root identity at some point. I don't see how I can get around it.
You said you need a root identity.
Well, just in terms of the calculation here. In other words, you just brought up the right example. In other words, if someone can go in and out of, I mean, one of the problems is that a lot of the security problems now come from there's not kids hacking. These are professional criminals who have huge resources, and so if they're thrown out of one world, they're going to come back in again. They're going to come back in again, and so the extent to which you can make that a big cost. And again, it gets back to the trust thing. How do you make the cost higher than the payoff? Then you're gonna reduce the likelihood of that happening.
Well, but you're implying that there's somebody who's making up rules about root identity and stuff. I think in virtual worlds, I get to make up all the rules.
Well, I mean, I think everyone can do what they want. I mean, in that sense. But then you're going to have different risk levels. So if you don't have a root identity in one world, there may be a level of transactions that you're not willing to engage in because the Eastern European, whatever it is, group mafia is going to come in and game it. And Whereas you say, I'd be willing to make other kind of, in this other world, I'll do different sets of transactions. And because I know it's a root identity, it's much harder to do that, and it has higher costs. It's not as much fun, and I won't do everything there. But so as you start to partition out the risk. Yeah.
The thing I'm struggling with is who's empowered to make those root identity claims? I mean, I can't think of any one who would ever be.
What? No, you already have it in the DOD is doing that right now.
But I mean,
the government makes those claims all the time. I mean, you have a birth certificate, and you're just trying to link you physically to any certain claims or rights you have.
I can't link myself to my birth certificate. I mean, there's no way I can.
But they tried it. But there's an attempt to say, well, they're going to. You have some. Would it be a footprint? That's your footprint that is uniquely yours. Attempt to link you to your physical you. Now, if you can have other biometrics, you can do things, like thumbprints, you can do retinal scans, whatever, or the pictures, the facial recognition. I mean, so you can have multi-factor biometrics that then link you to an identifier.
You can have VeriSign extended to this model. They already serve.
Sorry.
Identity.
I just think culturally, like, the idea of everybody in this country, anyway, being linked to a biometric thing is going to be very, very unpalatable.
I think it's not. I think it's going to happen. I think how it happens is extremely important, and it is happening with real ID. I mean,
How many states?
Yeah, no, a real ID may not go in the states, but you're going to have. I mean, if you have one more terrorist attack, a bad terrorist attack, you're going to watch HSPD 12 everywhere. You think, and if you don't think of the Patriot Act is nasty, see what happens when we get another one. I mean, I have an implant. Sorry.
I'm inclined to agree with the objections that have been raised about root identity notions. That for a lot of online activity, it's less important that you know specifically who this person is than it is to know who they've also been in the past, that there's a consistency that you've been able to watch. I mean, I'm reminded of years and years ago, I was working someplace with a fellow who argued that, we should get rid of all titles and all hierarchy in the entire company. And somebody said, well, but, if we did that, how would you ever know, whether somebody was telling you something that you should believe? And I said, well, maybe you'd have to listen. Now, the point is, I'm not going to sit here and argue that he was right or that the objectors are right either, but I think there is an interesting point in online life, which is that the way most of us, for example, in going back to news groups of, 20-some years, the way you decided whether somebody was telling you something that you could believe was not just by examining just that one post they made, but also by realizing that you'd been reading their posts over probably a period of some months, and so even if you didn't really know who this person was, you'd never met them, you didn't know where they lived, you didn't know what they did, you did know what behavior they exhibited.
Well, no, I totally agree with it, and I do think that behavioral metrics become very important, and they become an independent way of mitigating and managing risk. But in that situation, you could have a big game like you do EBA reputations.
That is totally game because.
Unless you have, and I'm just getting back to your question, is like, what prevents you from going in and out of different worlds? If you get thrown out of one, unless there's something that is anchored and rooted. But you may not.
You can't just go back in and instantly have 6 months worth of traffic that people would be able to see.
Oh no! You'd have to go in. You'd lose that.
Right.
You'd lose that.
Well, that's losing everything.
Well, but you could make it up again. You could. You're not. It's a question of punishment. It's a simple equation. Is saying, okay, what is the cost, the payoff? If that's enough, you throw someone out that they're willing to do that. Or are there certain kind of one-time transactions that are so high, e.g., national security, that they went to city, that's and someone was gaming it for 20 years, and everyone thought they're the greatest member of the community, and in that moment they came in, so I yeah.
You began your slides by explaining these preconscious processes, right. Dopamine, fight, flight, endorphins, things like that. How is that, how that affects how few choices we're maybe making? How's that shaping some of your research now, or some of your own areas of inquiry? And by the way, you told your wife you're into her just for the dopamine.
Oxytocin is what it actually is. Women are very good at oxytocin. And oxytocin, we have great hope for oxytocin. I think what it does is it makes you aware. You think that people, your natural inclination is to think that people are making choices, rational choices, and so and in fact. Even yourself. And then you say, well, no, wait. There's certain trigger events that happen, and there's certain signals that go off, and you have these sort of reflexive actions that people have. And that's a huge amount of the activity that takes place. I mean, if you look at a lot of these social affinity sites and why do they work, and how they sort of, and how they're able to build participation and membership. A lot of it is not, I don't think, a rational model. It's sort of deconstruct. And then marketing firms are now going after this for good or for ill, and then understanding children and marketing children on this basis. I think there's a lot of ethical issues around this. But it really changes how we think about it and how we analyze it. Sorry, yes?
Last time I saw HSPD 12, it had 11 optional items on the front. Is it going to go very far with 2,048 different combinations of forms?
My sense is that they're pushing this thing very hard, and I think it's going to create a lot of paralysis. But it's the government, and from what I can tell, there's a mandate to do it, and all the contractors are required to do it. And though if you look at there's a project for the trying to think which fighter it is, but it's a new joint tactical fighter between the British and the Americans that we're developing, and they can't go anywhere with it because they don't know how to share credentials across different groups, and they don't have a process for doing that. So there's this total paralysis, and then they start to discover a lot of the contractors are in worlds in developing countries that they consider very suspect, and they don't know how to secure them, and it just sort of falls off the table. Sorry.
This is just a background question, but can you say a little bit about what HSP-12 is?
Well, it's a Homeland Security sort of. I mean, gentlemen here know this much more than I, but it's an identity card, authentication card is required when you have two biometrics for people to be in the military. But it becomes the building blocks on so many other things. And so it says once that becomes established, it sets a precedent, then things get layered on top of that and get layered on top of that. And that's how they start to think about security. Yeah.
You were talking about preconscious decision-making in identity in the real world. Do you think in the virtual world that means that these decisions become more conscious on how we identify ourselves? Or do you think
I'm not sure of that. I mean, I think there's an opportunity to do that. But I think what you find is in the fantasies and how people invent themselves and how they display themselves, that they're sort of expressing these old ways of doing things just emerge, and so that my preferred body, okay, I'm going to be, Superman type, have a perfect symmetry and everything else. So.
Is there any research on going from one world to the other if people choose different ways of identifying themselves that are more real to who they are?
I'm sorry.
That's kind of vague, I know.
I think we're just at the beginning of this. It's just social experimentation that's just taking place at very, very early phases. But the point I was trying to make was interesting to see that some people say, well, gee, maybe there's a persistent identity that looks like me, and I'm comfortable with that. And I'm going to clean up, I'm going to lose a little weight, clean things up, make it a little better, but basically it's me. And I think that's probably what's going to happen.
You don't think they'd split and become more psychotic?
What?
You don't think they'd split and splinter?
I think with some people they would.
I would think they would.
Yeah, I think with some people you're going to get a split. But remember, the businesses are really taking this up. And so I was talking to IBM, and they're saying, well, how do we manage it? What's the protocol coming to a business meeting? Can I be another gender? Can I be can I be a raccoon head? I mean, what? So what do you think of your? Gee, that's not terribly appropriate. Why are you like that all the time? And then, so okay, and maybe not a coat and tie, but so you start these norms start to infiltrate in. Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned the Intera project as you talked about currency systems.
Right. Well, there's been an effort underway in a number of years called Intera, which is in a sense how to create social currencies, and it's a reward. And it was started by a guy named Greg Stoltenpohl. Started, and then D. Hock, D. Hock was one of the founders of Visa, and the long and the short of it is that people should be able to express their value preferences into market choices, and so that if there's a way in which you can sort of identify vendors who are green, or vendors who are local, or vendors who are helping a community, you can tag them, and you can generate some rewards programs based upon directing your dollars there. So you're creating a community around a set of value preferences that reflects some sort of social good. And part of that is how do you take economic externalities and fold them in, and then create market choices to then accelerate innovation? And how do you then aggregate what might be not a viable market outside, but with a high social preferences? And people say, well, we'll aggregate the market, and that will be sufficient to generate new kinds of supply. And so I think this whole kind of network, this whole sort of new layer is going to facilitate that kind of thing. All right. Thank you.